California has always been the place people come to. The gold rush, the movies, the beaches, the tech boom. The state has spent most of its history pulling people in. But not everything that drew a crowd kept one. Here are 11 places in California that used to be packed. Now they're nearly empty. Place 11, Salton Sea, California's accidental resort. The Salton Sea sits in the desert of the Imperial Valley, about 150 miles southeast of Los Angeles. It is California's largest lake by surface area, roughly 35 miles long and 15 miles wide, and it shouldn't exist at all. It was created by accident between 1905 and 1907 when an irrigation canal from the Colorado River broke, flooding the Salton Sink for nearly 2 years before engineers managed to stop the flow. The resulting body of water, stranded in one of the hottest, driest regions on the continent, became, improbably, one of the most popular resort destinations in California. Through the 1950s and into the 1970s, the Salton Sea was genuinely thriving. The communities on its northern shore, Desert Shores, Salton Sea Beach, and most significantly Salton City, were developed with the expectation of becoming the Palm Springs of the waterfront. Water skiing competitions attracted national attention. Frank Sinatra reportedly vacationed there. The beach communities had marinas, seafood restaurants, boat rental shops, and the general infrastructure of a functioning resort economy. The collapse came gradually and then quickly. The Salton Sea has no outlet. Water flows in from agricultural runoff and the New and Alamo rivers, but has nowhere to go except evaporation. Over decades, the salt concentration increased steadily. Pesticide and fertilizer runoff from the Imperial Valley's intensive agriculture made the water increasingly toxic. Fish began dying in massive numbers. The smell, hydrogen sulfide from the decomposing fish and algae blooms, became significant enough to be detectable in Los Angeles on certain wind conditions. By the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the resort communities were emptying. Property values collapsed. Businesses closed. The marinas were left as concrete structures slowly being swallowed by receding, increasingly saline water. The beaches that had drawn water skiers and sunbathers became crusted with fish bones and barnacles. The permanent population of the shoreline communities dropped from tens of thousands to a few hundred. I remember when this was the place to be on a summer weekend. You couldn't find a spot on the beach. Now you can drive for miles and not see a soul. A former resident of Desert Shores, quoted in a 2015 documentary on the Salton Sea. Today, the Salton Sea is an environmental crisis in slow motion. As the water level drops, the exposed lakebed becomes a source of wind-blown dust that contributes to some of the worst air quality in the state. The communities of the Imperial Valley, many of them low income and predominantly Latino, bear the health consequences. The state of California has committed funding to dust suppression projects and wetland restoration on the receding shoreline, but the scale of the problem far exceeds the resources currently allocated to it. Place 10, Bodie, a gold rush town, frozen in time. Bodie sits in the high desert of Mono County, about 75 miles southeast of Lake Tahoe, at an elevation of 8,375 feet. It is the best preserved ghost town in California and one of the best in the American West. Not restored or reconstructed, but preserved in what the State Park Service describes as a state of arrested decay, meaning things are stabilized enough not to collapse, but left to look exactly as they were abandoned. Gold was discovered near Bodie in 1859 by W.S. Bodie, who died in a blizzard that same winter and never saw what his find would become. The town, that took a slightly modified version of his name, grew slowly through the 1860s and then exploded in 1877 when a mine collapse revealed an exceptionally rich ore body. At its peak, around 1879 and 1880, Bodie had a population estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 people. Contemporary accounts describe daily gunfights and describe Bodie as one of the most lawless towns in the West. The decline was as rapid as the rise. By the early 1880s, the richest ore had been extracted, and the population began dropping sharply. A series of fires damaged the town in 1892 and 1932. The last mine closed in 1942. By the time California declared it a state historic park in 1962, Bodie had been largely abandoned for decades, with only a caretaker family remaining. What makes Bodie remarkable is the condition of what's left. Approximately 170 structures remain standing. Homes, a church, a schoolhouse, a bank, the mill, with furniture, tools, dishes, and personal belongings still inside. The Methodist Church still has its organ. A pool table sits in one of the former saloons. The artifacts weren't preserved or collected. They were simply left when people walked out. Visiting Bodie is less like visiting a museum and more like walking through a place where everyone went somewhere else and never came back. The roads to Bodie are unpaved for the last 3 miles and can be impassable in winter. The park draws around 200,000 visitors a year, which for an active destination would be modest, but for a site this remote feels significant. The emptiness is the point. Place 9, Bombay Beach, the last residence of a sunken shore. Bombay Beach is a small community on the eastern shore of the Salton Sea that is worth treating separately from the broader Salton Sea entry because its story is specific and strange in ways that go beyond the lake's general collapse. At its post-war peak, Bombay Beach had a genuine residential community. Families, retirees, a gas station, a diner, a market. The community sat close enough to the waterline to be partly inundated during high water periods in the 1970s, when agricultural runoff raised the lake's level. Parts of the town were flooded and never rebuilt. The ruins of submerged structures, car bodies, boat docks, bait shops, still sit in the shallows, slowly oxidizing. The current population of Bombay Beach hovers around 250 to 300 people, making it one of the smallest incorporated communities in California. The median household income is among the lowest in the state. The infrastructure is minimal. Some streets, a small beach, a bar called the Ski Inn that has been operating since the 1960s and serves as the de facto community center. What happened next is one of the more unexpected stories in California's landscape of decline. In the mid-2000s, Bombay Beach began attracting artists, drawn by the extreme affordability of the derelict properties. Homes were selling for $500 or $1,000, and by the surreal quality of the landscape, the crusted shoreline, the rusted infrastructure, the clarity of the desert light, the sense of being at the end of something. The Bombay Beach Biennale, an art festival that began in 2016, brought installations, performances, and a transient population of artists and art world figures to the community each spring. The relationship between the long-standing residents and the art world arrivals is complicated in the way these relationships always are. The town is still desperately poor. The art installations don't pay anyone's rent, but the Biennale put Bombay Beach on a map it had fallen off decades earlier. And the photographs that come out of it, sun-bleached installations against the cracked lakebed, rusted machinery framed against purple desert sunsets, have given the place a second life as a subject even as the first life continues its slow dissolution. Place 8, Trona, the chemicals town that chemistry forgot. Trona is a community in San Bernardino County, about 20 miles northwest of the town of Ridgecrest in the Mojave Desert. It exists because of the mineral deposits in Searles Lake, the dry lake bed on which it sits, which contains some of the world's richest concentrations of industrial minerals. Trona Minerals, the company that has operated the chemical extraction facility there since the late 19th century, built the town to house its workers. At its mid-20th century peak, Trona had a population of several thousand, a functioning downtown with a department store, a bowling alley, a hotel, a hospital, and the organized civic life of a company town that took its obligations to its workers seriously. The school system had a reputation for quality. The community had sports teams and a social fabric that sustained itself despite the extreme remoteness and the industrial smell that came with living next to a chemical processing plant. The population today is somewhere around 1,500 and declining. The downtown is largely shuttered. The hospital closed years ago. The department store is a memory. What remains is the processing plant, still operating, still extracting minerals from Searles Lake, and a residential community that serves it, reduced to a fraction of its former size as automation reduced the labor requirements of the operation, and as the general economic logic of remote company towns continued its long decline. The 2019 Ridgecrest earthquakes, which had magnitudes of 6.4 and 7.1 on successive days in July, caused significant damage to Trona's already fragile building stock. Many structures were damaged beyond economical repair. The recovery was slow and incomplete. Trona also sits within driving distance of the Trona Pinnacles, a field of calcium carbonate tufa spires rising from the dry lake bed that is one of the more otherworldly landscapes in California, used as a filming location for Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and other productions requiring an alien-looking environment. The Pinnacles draw visitors who mostly stop, photograph, and leave without spending any time in the town itself. Place 7, Isleton, the Delta town that the Delta left behind. Isleton sits in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, about 30 miles south of Sacramento on the Sacramento River. It is a small city, population around 800, with a downtown of Victorian-era commercial buildings, a waterfront, and a history that reaches back to the 1870s when it served as a supply and processing center for the Delta's agricultural economy. The Delta was one of the most intensively farmed agricultural regions in California through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Asparagus in particular was a major crop, and Isleton was the center of the asparagus canning industry, with canneries that employed thousands of workers, Chinese laborers initially, then Japanese and Filipino workers as exclusion laws and labor dynamics shifted. The town had a Chinatown, a Japantown, and a Filipino community in successive eras, layering its history in ways visible in the surviving architecture. The asparagus industry collapsed in the latter half of the 20th century as competition from imports and changing agricultural economics made Delta asparagus uncompetitive. The canneries closed, the workforce dispersed. The towns that had served the agricultural economy found themselves without the economic foundation that had built them. Isleton today has its downtown buildings, a few restaurants, a bar or two that cater to the weekend boating crowd that uses the Delta waterways. The rest of the time, it is quiet in the way that small towns in agricultural regions that have lost their agriculture tend to be quiet, which is to say, very quiet, with the particular emptiness of a place built for more people than currently live there. There's more history per square foot in this town than most places have in a whole county. The problem is that history doesn't pay the bills. An Isleton business owner quoted in a Sacramento Bee feature on Delta Towns, "There's more history per square foot in this town than most places have in a whole county. The problem is that history doesn't pay the bills." An Isleton business owner quoted in a Sacramento Bee feature on Delta Towns. Place 6, Niland, Slab City's neighbor, nobody's destination. Niland sits about 5 miles north of Bombay Beach on the eastern shore of the Salton Sea, and its story rhymes with the broader Salton Sea decline, while adding its own specific details. At its agricultural peak, Niland served as a supply town for Imperial Valley farm workers and had the infrastructure of a functioning small community. The population today is around 900 people, down significantly from mid-century highs, and the town's infrastructure reflects decades of disinvestment. What keeps Niland on the map, such as it is its proximity to Slab City, the off-grid community established on the concrete slabs of a decommissioned World War II Marine Corps base called Camp Dunlap, about 2 miles east of town. Slab City has been continuously occupied since the base was decommissioned in 1956 and has developed a reputation as one of the last free places in America, a community of retirees living in RVs, and people who have concluded that off-grid desert living is preferable to whatever the alternative was. It has no running water, no electricity grid, no formal governance. The population swells in winter when the desert is temperate to several hundred or more and drops dramatically in summer when temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees. Salvation Mountain, the painted adobe and hay bale hillside installation, created by Leonard Knight beginning in 1984 and expanded over 3 decades, sits at the entrance to Slab City and has become one of the more photographed folk art environments in the American West. Knight died in 2014, but the mountain, maintained by volunteers, continues to draw visitors. It is, in a meaningful sense, the most maintained thing in the vicinity of Niland. Place 5, Mendocino. Thriving in Instagram, struggling in reality. Mendocino requires a different kind of attention than most of the places on this list, because it is not empty in the way that Bodie or Trona or Niland is empty. The village, technically a census-designated place rather than an incorporated city, with a permanent population of around 900, sits on a headland above the Pacific coast in Mendocino County, and is genuinely beautiful in the way that few places in California are. Photographers have been coming here for a century. The problem Mendocino faces is the hollowing out of a living community by the economics of coastal California real estate and short-term vacation rental platforms. The permanent population has been declining for years as longtime residents, the people who run the actual functions of a community, are priced out by second home buyers and vacation rental operators who have converted residential housing stock into tourist accommodations. The result is a town that looks alive from the outside and is functionally hollowed out from the inside. The galleries and inns and restaurants that serve visitors are still there, but the school enrollment has dropped. The volunteer fire department has struggled to maintain staffing. The grocery store that served the local population closed in 2019. The community that built and maintained Mendocino's character over generations is being replaced by a rotating population of visitors who come for a weekend and leave. This is not unique to Mendocino. It is happening in coastal communities from Malibu to Carmel to Stinson Beach. But Mendocino is small enough and isolated enough that the process is visible in a way it isn't in larger communities, and the gap between the photogenic exterior and the functional reality has become striking. It also serves as a preview of what other California coastal towns will look like in another decade if the same economic forces continue without any policy response. Beautiful, well-photographed, and inhabited mostly by people who are visiting rather than people who belong there. Place 4, Locke, the last rural Chinatown in America. Locke sits in the Sacramento Delta, about 5 miles north of Isleton, and it is the only rural town in the United States built and inhabited almost exclusively by Chinese immigrants. It was established in 1915 after a fire destroyed the Chinatown section of the nearby town of Walnut Grove, and Chinese residents who had been living and working in the Delta for decades built Locke on land leased from a rancher named George Locke, whose name the town took. At its peak in the 1940s, Locke had a population of around 600 to 800 people, a dense, functioning community with restaurants, boarding houses, a school, gambling halls, and the full social infrastructure of a community that had built itself from the ground up under conditions of significant legal hostility. Chinese immigrants in California were prohibited from owning land under the California Alien Land Law of 1913. The buildings in Locke were owned by the residents, but the land beneath them was leased, a legal arrangement that reflected the constraints Chinese Californians operated under for much of the 20th century. The population today is fewer than 100 people. The main street, literally 1 block long, has a handful of surviving businesses, including Al's Place, a bar that has been operating since the Prohibition era when it functioned as a speakeasy. The buildings along the main street still stand, still look largely as they did in the 1920s and 30s, and the California Department of Parks and Recreation has designated the town a state historical landmark. Locke is a place where the emptiness carries a specific historical weight. The people who built it were excluded from most of California's civic and economic life, built something remarkable anyway, and then saw it empty not from violence or disaster, but from the same economic and demographic pressures that have emptied small agricultural towns across the state. The young people left for cities. The old people died. The buildings remain. My grandfather came here with nothing and built a life. His children left for San Francisco and never came back. That's not a tragedy. That's just what happened. A descendant of Locke's original residents, quoted in an oral history project by the Sacramento Delta Historical Society. Tillis, Place 3, Vallejo, the Navy town that the Navy left. Vallejo is a city of about 120,000 people in Solano County, at the northern end of San Pablo Bay, and it does not fit neatly into the category of nearly empty. The city is still populated, still functioning, still a place where people live and work. But the Vallejo that existed for most of the 20th century, built around and dependent on the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, is genuinely gone. And the city has spent more than 3 decades trying to figure out what comes after. Mare Island, connected to Vallejo by a bridge across the Mare Island Strait, was the first U.S. naval facility on the Pacific coast, established in 1854. At its peak during World War II, it employed over 45,000 workers building and repairing naval vessels. The shipyard was the economic engine of Vallejo and the surrounding region for over a century, supporting a dense network of housing, retail, restaurants, and services that served the military workforce and their families. The Navy closed Mare Island in 1996 as part of the post-Cold War base realignment and closure process. The loss of the shipyard wiped out the economic foundation of Vallejo with a speed the city was unprepared for. The population dropped. Retail collapsed. The downtown, which had been a functioning commercial district, emptied rapidly. In 2008, Vallejo became the largest American city in decades to file for municipal bankruptcy, citing pension obligations and collapsed tax revenues that followed the loss of the shipyard economy. The recovery has been partial and uneven. Mare Island itself has been partially redeveloped. Some of the historic buildings have been converted to commercial and residential use. A brewery operates there. Film productions use the facilities. But the full build-out promised by successive development plans has moved slowly. The downtown has some signs of life, but has not returned to what it was. Vallejo is a city with 120,000 people and an economic infrastructure scaled for fewer. Place 2, Boron, the mining town running on fumes. Boron is a small community in Kern County in the western Mojave Desert, about 100 miles northeast of Los Angeles, and it exists entirely because of the borax mine that sits immediately adjacent to it. The mine, operated by Rio Tinto Minerals under the brand name US Borax, is the largest open-pit borax mine in the world, and it has been producing continuously since 1927. The town was built to house the miners and their families. At its mid-century peak, Boron had a population of around 2,500, a school system, a community center, and the social infrastructure of a functioning company town. The 20 Mule Team Museum in town commemorates the historic method of transporting borax out of Death Valley. The actual 20 mule teams that hauled borax wagons from Death Valley to Mojave between 1883 and 1889, and the product's place in American industrial history. The population today is around 2,000 and declining. The mine continues operating, and the borax deposits are enormous, estimated to contain enough material to sustain production for centuries. But automation has steadily reduced the number of workers needed to extract and process the ore. A workforce that once required thousands of employees to manage now requires a fraction of that, and the community scaled to support that larger workforce has contracted accordingly. A prolonged strike at the mine in 2010 and 2011, when approximately 570 workers walked out over a contract dispute with Rio Tinto, drew national attention to the community and to the precarity of single-industry towns. The strike lasted nearly 2 years and ended with the workers ratifying a contract in 2012. Many strikers lost their positions to replacement workers during the dispute. The community that emerged from it was smaller and more economically fragile than the one that had entered it. Place 1, Playa del Rey, the neighborhood. That LAX-ate. Playa del Rey is a neighborhood in Los Angeles, situated on the coast just south of Marina del Rey and immediately north of Los Angeles International Airport. It has a beach, a lagoon, and some of the most dramatic coastal scenery in urban Los Angeles. It also has a problem. A significant portion of the neighborhood was demolished by the city of Los Angeles between the 1960s and 1980s to create a noise buffer zone around the expanding airport. The neighborhood that existed before the demolitions was a dense, middle-class residential community of bungalows and small apartment buildings. Residents who had bought homes there in the post-war period, attracted by the beach location, the relative affordability, the community character, found themselves subject to eminent domain proceedings as the city acquired properties to reduce noise complaints from airport operations. Approximately 800 homes and businesses were eventually demolished in what became known as the Dunes area. The cleared land was not redeveloped. It was left as open space, which the city has variously described as a noise buffer, a park, and a potential future development site depending on the era and the political pressures at play. What remains is a strange landscape of empty lots, curving streets that lead nowhere, fire hydrants and utility connections that serve buildings that no longer exist, and the occasional foundation slab where a house used to be. The remaining sections of Playa del Rey, the coastal bluff above the beach, the street south of the demolished zone, are still a residential neighborhood, and property values there are high because coastal Los Angeles property values are always high regardless of what's happening nearby. But the missing middle of the neighborhood, the Ghost Street grid of the dunes, is one of the more unusual urban landscapes in California. A deliberate absence, a place that was full and was emptied not by economic decline or environmental disaster, but by a decision that the noise produced by jet traffic was worth more than the homes of the people who lived there. The streets that were cleared still exist on old maps and in the memories of former residents. Jefferson Boulevard, which once ran through the heart of the demolished area, now dead ends at the edge of the buffer zone. Pershing Drive curves through a grass field where houses once stood on either side. The infrastructure of a neighborhood, the street layout, the curbs, the occasional utility fixture, exists without the neighborhood it was built to serve. It is less a ruin than an erasure, and the distinction matters. They gave us fair market value for 1965, which meant we had to start over somewhere else. The neighborhood we'd built our lives in just stopped existing. A former Playa del Rey resident, quoted in a Los Angeles Times retrospective on the airport demolitions, California is a state that has always operated on the assumption of more. More people, more growth, more economic activity, more everything. But the places on this list are what happens when that assumption runs out. When the water turns toxic, when the Navy leaves, when the mine automates, when the economy that built a place decides it no longer needs it. Some of these places are genuinely gone. Bodie is a monument to its own absence. The Salton Sea resort towns are beyond practical recovery, but others are still inhabited, still functioning in diminished form, still carrying the weight of what they used to be while figuring out what they are now. These are places where people still live, and where the history of California's growth and its uneven consequences is visible in the landscape itself. The state spent 150 years filling up. The question it hasn't fully answered is what it owes to the places the filling left behind. If this gave you a different picture of California than the one on the postcard, hit like and subscribe. More coming on the places the boom passed through and didn't take with it. See you in the next one.